Day of the Dead Moon, Part 3.
Lord Chelmsford, you will remember, had left Isandlwana at 3:30 a.m. on that Wednesday, the 22nd of January, and was, as it happened, destined to spend the most frustrating day of his life skirmishing with small parties of Zulus. Chelmsford took over half the force off to the southeast to reinforce Dartnell, who thought that he was in touch with the main Zulu army, and by the time the sun rose, Chelmsford was out of sight of the camp at Isandlwana. It soon became apparent to all that the force of Zulus which Dartnell had encountered the previous evening had gone, and Chelmsford bombshelled his force and began to scour all the hills to the southeast, searching for the elusive enemy. Chelmsford got to the base of the Siluchana hill, and from there they heard the rocket tube being fired. He sent a man up Siluchana with a telescope. The man shouted down that everything appeared to be fine. He could see a large body of black soldiers moving across in front of Isandlwana. "My, those NNC fellows are learning to drill beautifully," was the comment. It wasn't the NNC. It was the Nkoba Makosi regiment of the Zulu army. Chelmsford had received Pulane's first message, and understandably this failed to alarm him. He turned south, eventually arriving at the head of a picturesque gorge into which plunges a beautiful waterfall. He selected the new campsite, and sent Gardner back to tell Pulane to strike the camp. He then heard the sound of field guns firing from Isandlwana, and disturbed by this he sent 2 officers to the top of the Umduchana hill, a conical hill that lies 12 miles to the southeast of Isandlwana. They were sent up to the summit with a naval telescope, and through it they peered at the British camp, way off in the distant haze. One of these officers was destined to become a famous man. He was Lieutenant Berkeley Milne, Royal Navy, in due course to become Admiral Sir Berkeley Milne, Admiral of the fleet in World War I. They shouted down at Chelmsford, "It's all right, sir. Everything seems to be all right. We can see that the camp has not been struck." The fact that the tents were still erect was telling them that the camp was not under threat. Chelmsford, however, was still uneasy, and decided to send Commandant George Maury Hamilton Brown back to Isandlwana with a large force of NNC to see what was happening. Hamilton Brown took his force to the top of a low ridge 4.5 miles from Isandlwana. From there he could see the camp, and was shocked to see that there was a full-blown battle on the go. He sent a series of messages back to Chelmsford advising of this. But I believe these messages unfortunately were distorted by staff officers, so the only message Chelmsford received told him that these colonials, of whom Hamilton Brown was one, were exaggerating again. Hamilton Brown's last message, however, could not be misinterpreted. It read, "For God's sake, come back with all your men. The camp is surrounded, and it must be taken unless helped." This message served to galvanize Chelmsford. The men were collected and simply informed that they were to march back to camp. But the rumour spread quickly through the ranks, how long those miles were, and how our eyes were strained towards the Sphinx Mountain and the camp. We all had brothers, cousins, and loved ones in that camp. Earlier, Lord Chelmsford had dispatched an officer of the NNC by the name of Rupert Delatour Lonsdale back to the camp at Isandlwana to organise rations for the NNC, who hadn't been fed for a while and were starting to complain. Lonsdale was a poor choice. He was overweight and out of condition. He was suffering from sunstroke and concussion, and to add to all this, he was very poorly mounted on a feeble crock of a horse called Dot. Lonsdale fell asleep in Dot's saddle. The horse knew the way back to the camp, particularly to the picket line where she was hoping to be watered and fed. And Dot carried the sleeping Lonsdale onto the battlefield. The battle was over, but the Zulus were still there, looting and disemboweling the dead. Lonsdale never realized anything was amiss until he was well inside the camp. The first thing that brought him to his senses was a bullet that whistled past his ear and the report of a Martini Henry rifle. He emerged from his slumbers to see a huge Zulu with a dripping assegai in his hand coming for him. He glanced about and became instantly aware of what had happened. Dot, however, was now on strike. She'd been carrying the overweight Lonsdale around since long before dawn, and she now wanted to be watered and fed, and only after much kicking and cajoling and swearing and spurring, and under a hail of assegais and lead, did Lonsdale manage to escape, and it was this stumbling, panic-stricken figure leading his fatigued pony that came upon Chelmsford coming the other way. Lonsdale delivered his famous message, "The camp, my lord, has been taken by the Zulus, and all our men in it have been massacred." Chelmsford put his head in his hands and said, "My God, I left over 1,000 men to guard that camp." Chelmsford, to his credit, lined everyone up and told them what had happened. He said that his information was that the camp had fallen to the Zulus and many brave men had lost their lives in trying to hold it, and that it was his intention now, with the support of the men, to go and take that camp back from the Zulus. And the men cheered him. Exhausted as they were, having marched for more than 30 miles on the hottest day imaginable, and having now confirmed to them that one of the great military defeats of all time had occurred, they cheered their general. Only the British could do that. They proceeded towards Isandlwana, and by the time they reached Durnford's Donga it was dark. The scene was incredibly eerie, with the great Sphinx of Isandlwana silhouetted up against the starlit sky, and the bivouac fires of the Zulu army peppering the Ngutu heights to the north, indicating that the Zulu force was close enough for the threat of another Zulu attack to be imminent. Arthur Harness of the Royal Artillery was ordered to limber up the 7-pounders that Chelmsford had taken out with him, and several shells were fired at the camp. But there was no living person in that camp. The rolling of those guns was heard by Redvers Buller and Evelyn Wood 80 miles to the north. Buller turned to Wood and said, "Did you hear that, sir? The central column must be in trouble." Indeed, it was. Major Wilson Black, that famous soldier, famous for the way in which he used to swear at his men in Gaelic, was then ordered to lead a bandit charge up the south flank of the camp and to take the stony hill south of the saddle, whichever afterwards was to bear his name, Black's copy, and a British cheer crashed out across the field. The men tell us that this was their cue. They were told to spread out in a skirmishing order and to move up towards the camp 2,000 yards away. They crunched through Durnford's Donga, over the thousands of expended brass cartridge cases that littered its floor, and then began to move up the gentle grassy slope that extended up towards the Sphinx. The first several hundred yards were easy going, and then they started to stumble upon big soft things. They were the bodies of their comrades. Trooper Davy trips and falls into a donga, and gets his forearm caught up in the body cavity of a dead soldier. He tells his mother in a letter that it took 2 weeks to get the smell of this man's entrails off his arm. Trooper Simon said that they reached the camp well after dark. It must have been about 9 o'clock, he thought. The whole place had been burned down to the ground, and there was the terrible stench of disemboweled humanity mixed up with the smells of smashed medicines. A smell, the men tell us, not unlike that of a rotten sweet potato that had been brought to the boil. Never had such a disaster happened to the British Army. Lord Chelmsford ordered everyone to form up on the saddle. The men were told to stand to in a huge ring with their ammunition, such small supply as they had left at the ready. They were told not to sleep. But many couldn't help themselves, and they lay down in the grass, which was sticky and slimy to the touch, sticky with blood and slimy with gore, and fell asleep, finding later to their horror that they'd been using the bodies of their comrades as pillows. But there was no sleep for Lord Chelmsford. He paced up and down on the bare ground of the saddle all night. Hamilton Brown, that rough diamond of a New Zealander, was with him. Rough diamond he may have been, but he could write beautifully, and in his book, Lost Legionary in South Africa, he captures the moment. They looked off to the west, and they could see a series of fires which in that night marked the Natal border, and way off to the west they noticed that a great fire was right then silhouetting the Oscarberg mountain at Rorke's Drift. They cupped their ears and strained them to the west, and they could just hear the dim crackle of rifle fire. My God, Rorke's Drift was being attacked. The Zulus were in Natal. Things obviously were going badly, and the worst of their fears was being realized. The Battle of Isandlwana was over. The Battle of Rorke's Drift had already begun, and the day's toll was not yet over. Lord Chelmsford obviously could not even attempt to bury the dead that night, and as it happened, the British dead were only to be buried several months later. This was for 2 very good reasons. Firstly, the Zulus would have to be subdued before burial on this sort of scale could take place, and secondly, the 24th Regiment had made the unusual but understandable request that they be allowed to bury their own dead, and there was simply not enough of them left to do it, and they would have to therefore wait for reinforcements. Chelmsford did, however, need the wagons that were strewn over the field of Isandlwana for his second invasion. Patrols indicated that a number of these were still intact. So a great expeditionary force was sent out to Isandlwana on the 21st of May, 1879, to fetch away these wagons. The force was under the command of Major General Marshall and was accompanied by the 17th Lancers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Drury Curzon Drury Lowe. This force was accompanied also by 2 men who left us the most haunting descriptions of what Isandlwana looked like that day. One of these was a famous impressionist artist, Melton Pryor, The other was a professional journalist, Archibald Forbes. Forbes's description is rated as one of the finest pieces of descriptive journalism that has ever come out of this country. Both appeared in the Illustrated London News on the 12th of July, 1879. Imagine picking up your copy of the ILN and reading this about the body of your boy, and that even on this date he had not yet been buried. Our artist writes as follows.
The sight I saw at Isandlwana is one I shall never forget. In all the 7 campaigns I have been in, the Ashanti War, the Carlist War in Spain, the campaigns of Bulgaria and the Balkan, and Romelia between the Russians and the Turks, and that of the preceding year in Herzegovina, and the Frontier War of 1878, I have not witnessed a scene more horrible. I have seen the dead and dying on a battlefield by hundreds and thousands, but to come suddenly on the spot where the slaughtered battalion of the 24th Regiment and others were lying at Isandlwana was far more appalling. Here I saw not the bodies, but the skeletons of men whom I had known in life and health, some of whom I had known well, mixed up with the skeletons of oxen and horses, and with wagons thrown on their sides, all in the greatest confusion, showing how furious had been the onslaught of the enemy. Amidst the various articles belonging to them which were scattered over the field of carnage were letters from wives at home to their husbands, from English fathers and mothers to their sons, portraits of those dear to them, and other homely little things, remembrances of the dearest associations. Skeletons of men lay on the open ground, bleaching under a tropical sun, along miles of country. The individuals could only be recognized by such things as a patched boot, a ring on a finger bone, a particular button or colored shirt, or a pair of socks in a few known instances. And this could only be done with much difficulty, for either the hands of the enemy or the beaks and claws of vultures tearing up the corpses had in numberless cases so mixed up the bones of the dead that the skull of one man, or bones of a leg or arm, now lay with parts of the skeleton of another. The lancers went about all over the field, often here and there quietly lifting the clothes off the skeletons, or gently pushing them on one side with their lances to see what regiment they belonged to. I almost regretted to see this done, for it seemed like sacrilege. But this is a time of war.
And Forbes's famous piece? Forbes came from the direction of Rorke's Drift, and from the ridge 3 miles west of Isandlwana he gazed upon the awesome scene.
At the top of the ascent, beyond the Bashi, which the Dragoon Guards crowned in dashing style, we saw on our left front, rising above the surrounding country, the steep, isolated, and almost inaccessible hill, or rather crag, of Isandlwana, the contour of its rugged crest strangely resembling a side view of a couchant lion. On the lower neck of the high ground, on its right, were clearly visible up against the skyline the abandoned wagons of the destroyed column. No Zulus were seen. Flanking parties covered the hills on each side of the track, along which the head of the column pressed at a trot, with small detachments of Natal Carbineers in front of the Dragoon Guards. Now we were down in the last dip, had crossed the rocky bed of the little stream, and were cantering up the slope that stretched up to the crest on which were the wagons. Already tokens of the combat and bootless flight were apparent. The line of retreat towards Fugitives' Drift, along which, through a chink in the Zulu environment, our unfortunate comrades, who thus far tried to escape, lay athwart a rocky slope to our right front, with a precipitous ravine at its base. In this ravine, dead men lay thick, mere bones with toughened, discolored skin like leather covering them and clinging tight to them, the flesh all wasted away. Some were almost wholly dismembered, heaps of clammy yellow bones. I forbear to describe the faces with their blackened features and beards blanched by the rain and sun. Every man had been disemboweled. Some were scalped, others subjected to yet ghastlier mutilation. The clothes had lasted better than the poor bodies they covered, and helped to keep the skeletons together. All the way up the slope, I traced by the ghastly token of dead men a fitful line of flight. Most of the men hereabouts were infantry of the 24th. It was like a long string with knots in it. The string formed of single corpses, the knots of clusters of the dead, where, as it seemed, little groups might have gathered to make a hopeless, gallant stand and die. I came on a gully with a gun limber jammed on its edge, and the horses, their hides scored with assegai stabs, hanging in their harnesses down the steep face of the ravine. A little further on was a broken and battered ambulance wagon, with its team of mules mouldering in their harnesses. And around lay the corpses of the soldiers, poor helpless wretches, dragged out of an intercepted vehicle, and done to death without a chance for life. Still following the trail of bodies through the long rank grass and among the stones, I approached the crest. Here the slaughtered ones lay very thick, so that the string became a broad belt. Many hereabouts wore the uniforms of the Natal police. On the bare ground on the crest itself, among the wagons, the dead were less thick, but on the slope beyond, on which from the crest we looked down, the scene was the saddest and more full of weird desolation than anything that I had ever gazed upon. There was none of the stark, blood-curdling horror of a recent battlefield. No pool of yet wet blood, no raw gaping wounds, no torn red flesh that seemed yet quivering. Nothing of all that makes the scene of yesterday's battle so rampantly ghastly shocked the senses. A strange, dead calm reigns in this solitude of nature. Grain has grown luxuriantly among the wagons, sprouting from the seed that dropped from the loads, falling in soil fertilized by the life-blood of gallant men. So long in most places has grown the grass that it mercifully shrouds the dead, whom 4 long months tomorrow we have left unburied. As one strayed aimlessly about, one stumbled in the grass over skeletons that rattled to the touch. Here lay a corpse with a bayonet jammed into the mouth up to the socket, transfixing the head and mouth a foot into the ground. There lay a form that seemed cosily curled in calm sleep, turned almost on its face, but 7 assegai stabs have pierced the back. Most, however, lay flat on the back, with the arms stretched widely out and the hands clenched. I noticed one dead man under a wagon with his head on a saddle for a pillow and a tarpaulin drawn up over him as if he'd gone to sleep and had died so. In a patch of long grass near the right flank of the camp lay Durnford's body. The long moustaches were still clinging to the withered skin of his face. Captain Shepston recognized him at once and identified him yet further by rings on the finger and a knife with the name on it in the pocket, which relics were brought away. Durnford had died hard, a central figure of a knot of brave men who had fought it out around their chief to the bitter end, and a stalwart Zulu, covered by his shield, lay at the colonel's feet.
The Buffalo River in the region of Fugitive Drift is a very different river from the slow, meandering river that it is in the Midlands, upstream near Rorke's Drift. Here, in these lower reaches, this is an angry, roaring torrent of water, cutting its way quickly through deep gorges on its way to its junction with the Tugela. Isandlwana lies 5 miles off to the northeast of Fugitive Drift. It was 5 miles of deeply dissected, boulder-strewn, bush-clad terrain that extends from the river to the Sphinx Mountain. For the British soldiers, this was terra incognita. There were no maps. They were not sure where they were going. The Zulu right horn had blocked the road to Rorke's Drift, and they were pushed into this rough country, caught, as it were, between the closing horns of the Zulu army. It was a pell-mell, helter-skelter. All the white soldiers on foot had been killed, but a fair number of men on horseback and large numbers of NNC men managed to get down to the Buffalo River. We think that there were 55 white men who escaped the fatal field of Isandlwana. And with very few exceptions, all those men crossed the Buffalo River at a place that was ever afterwards called the Fugitive Drift. Those men were required by the military authorities to leave accounts of what had happened at Isandlwana and why. And these accounts conclude with the most gripping descriptions of how the writers crossed this river. They allude to features in the topography that have not changed. That is the pleasure of this place. We have a much better understanding of what happened at Fugitive Drift, for the simple reason that men lived to tell this tale. The most lucid account of what happened here is, I believe, embodied in the letter which our friend Horace Lockwood Smith-Dorrien wrote to his father from the relative safety of the newly built fort at Rorke's Drift 3 days later. But there are a number of lively accounts which contribute to the saga. We are told that having escaped from the battle under the Sphinx Mountain, it was almost impossible to escape from the pursuing Zulus. Smith-Dorrien made the point that the Zulus on foot easily kept up with the British soldiers on horseback all the way, and there is something to contemplate in this. It is true to say that the topography on the trail mitigated in favour of the Zulus, but nevertheless here was an enemy, some of whose soldiers had run 100 miles to get to the field. These men may have run 15 miles during the course of the battle, and they could still stay with the men on horseback. When the British horsemen got to the top of the Pete Hill, they saw ahead of them patches of open country, and they thought that these were patches of grassland through which they could spur their horses in an effort to get clear of these howling savages, as they termed them. But they found to their horror that these were not patches of grassland. They were marshes, and the horses got stuck up to their hocks in these marshes, and the Zulus darted into the marshes, plucking the men from their saddles and running them through with their big broad blades. Smith-Dorrien tells us that they landed up on the top of a crag which dropped off into the gorge of the buffalo. It was a death trap. They had no idea that the crag was there, approaching as it were from the top, and this was the only crag along that whole stretch of river. It was as though the gods were against them, and one constantly has to remind oneself that the whole atmosphere was surreal. The whole environment was still bathed in that eerie quarter light of that eclipse of the sun. On the top of the crag they found a man lying on his side. He was a trooper called MacDonald of the Mounted Infantry. He was badly wounded, with a deep assegai slash through his arm. He begged Smith-Dorrien to help him bind the wound, which Smith-Dorrien did with a handkerchief. He had just bound up MacDonald's wound when up came Major Stuart Smith of the Royal Artillery. Smith had been in command of the 2 guns at Isandlwana, and had been badly wounded in attempting to save them. As Smith-Dorrien stared at the Major's ashen face, he could see that the Major was near to death from loss of blood, and the Major shouted at him, a shout that he was never to forget. "For God's sake, man, get on! The Zulus are on top of us!" Having done what he could for MacDonald, and having now been shouted at by the Major, Smith-Dorrien led his horse down the side of the cliff. When he got to its base, he heard that dreadful shout coming from above, the shout that the Zulus always shouted when they pulled their assegai blades from the chests of their victims. They would scream, "Gadla, I have eaten!" And he saw that in a flurry of spears, Major Smith of the Royal Artillery and the trooper, MacDonald, who he had just bound up, had become part of history. Smith-Dorrien glanced down at the river, and his stomach turned. This was not the placid stream that the men had crossed at Rorke's Drift when the invasion of Zululand started. This river was in a state of high flood, swollen with recent rains upstream. It was flowing from tree line to tree line, from bank to bank, 75 yards wide, 20 feet deep, and flowing at 10 knots. In his opinion, it was utterly unfordable. To make the situation more macabre, the black soldiers of the NNC were milling about on the alluvial plain on the Zulu bank of the Buffalo. The Zulu warriors of the Indluyengwe regiment were streaming down the slopes of the Pete Hill, and they'd pinned the NNC up against the river where these poor souls had Hobson's choice. They couldn't swim, so it was death by drowning or death by the big broad-bladed assegai. And there was a fearful slaughter going on down there, and it was through that bedlam that Smith-Dorrien cut his way with his sword. He made his way upstream on the Zulu side of the river and got caught up in the ledges of black tillite which drop off sheer into the Buffalo. He was leading his horse along the top of one of these ledges, thinking he was clear of the Zulus and looking upstream for a place to ford, when a Zulu nipped out from behind a bush and plunged an assegai into the horse's flank. The horse bolted, plunged over a bush-clad precipice, crashing to its death on the rocks below, and Smith-Dorrien was left, on foot, in the midst of the Zulus. He wrote to his dad that with the strong hope that everybody clings to that some accident would turn up, I rushed off on foot and plunged into the river. He goes on to describe how he was being spirited along by the brown waters of the Buffalo, when, as his luck had it, he bumped up against a riderless horse. Hanging on to the animal's tail, the gallant beast swam our friend Horace Lockwood Smith-Dorrien to the safety of the Natal bank of the Buffalo River, and Smith-Dorrien lives on to become that famous general, General Sir Horace Lockwood Smith-Dorrien. It was he who made the famous stand at Legato after Mons in August of 1914, a stand that he made contrary to General French's orders, but a stand which probably saved thousands of British lives. French fired him for his trouble, But Smith Dorrien went on to become the darling of the British public, and much called upon was he, in his later years as an after-dinner speaker, to relate the events of this day, the story of the Sphinx Mountain, the eclipse of the sun, the flight of the fugitives, and this flooded river, and how that shout must have reverberated through the brain of this man all his life. For God's sake, man, get on. The Zulus are on top of us here. And after all the horrors of this day, Horace Lockwood Smith Dorrien died outside Bath in 1930 in a car crash. There was lots of other drama at the Buffalo River. A private soldier of the South Staffordshire or 80th Regiment comes down to the river where, as James Brickhill, Lord Chelmsford's interpreter, described, there was a whirlpool which was filled with drowning horses and drowning men. And it was into this nightmare that Wassell plunged his horse. He was a good way through the river when he heard a gurgling coming from behind, and he turned and saw that the gurgling was coming from a comrade of his from the same South Staffordshire Regiment, a man called Westwood. Westwood was drowning. And without flinching, and this was the stuff of which this empire was made, Wassell turned the horse, swam it back to the Zulu bank, which was by then teeming with Zulus. He tethered the horse to a small tree and raced off and plunged into that whirlpool. He was one of the few British soldiers who could swim. He struck out to where Westwood was, being pushed around in the vortex of that whirlpool. He grabbed the half-drowned Westwood and, under fire, swam with him and draped him over a rock. He then, madman that he must have been, under fire swam back to the Zulu bank. He fought his way back to his horse with his mounted infantryman's sword. He untethered the horse, led it down to the water's edge, and swam it, again under fire, to where Westwood was. He managed to get the semi-conscious Westwood over the saddle, and managed to swim himself, Westwood, and the spirited horse to the safety of the Natal bank of the Buffalo River, and they, all three of them, lived on. Wassell to become the first member of his South Staffordshire Regiment ever to be awarded the Victoria Cross, which he won for valour in that little pool. The first of 14 VCs that were to be awarded for valour that day goes to Wassell. Between Colonel Henry Pullane and Lieutenant Tynemouth Melville at Isandlwana, you will take the colour, and Godspeed and God be with you. No one will ever know what a terrible ride Melville must have had from Isandlwana down to the Buffalo River, with that heavy Queen's colour furled and cased across the saddle of his horse. Most histories will tell you that two officers, Melville and a brother officer of the 24th by the name of Neville Josiah Aylmer Coghill, made the dash with the colour, but this is not so. Melville and Coghill did not ride together, and Coghill reached the Buffalo River before Melville did. He put his horse to the water. Coghill was a superb horseman and managed to get his horse out onto the Natal bank where a small stream joins the Buffalo. Lucky to be alive was he, but especially lucky considering that a couple of days prior to Isandlwana he had so badly sprained a knee whilst chasing a chicken for Lord Chelmsford's supper that he couldn't mount a horse unassisted. But here he was, high and dry on the Natal bank, uninjured apart from the knee, when he looked back across the river and he saw a drama developing that was to prompt him to commit his great act of courage. A large coffin-shaped rock, still there to this day, was just breaking the surface of the river. Attached to this rock was a man who was to survive this incident. His name was Walter Higginson. He was an officer of the Natal native contingent, and, wisely, from his point of view anyway, he decided to abandon his command of black soldiers on the Zulu bank. In the act of crossing the river, the horse had rolled with him. He had become separated from the horse, and he had bumped up against that coffin-shaped rock to which he was now attached. Higginson's testimony is essential to our understanding of this event. Higginson looked across the water at the Natal bank and saw Coghill, and Coghill saw him. He then looked upstream at the Zulu bank, and he saw a sight that he was never to forget. The sight was of an officer in a scarlet tunic with the Queen's colour furled and cased across the saddle of his horse, and being pushed down to the river by a large number of the proverbial howling savages. This man was Melville, and Higginson watches in awe as Melville plunges his horse into the water. And one can only conclude that such was the calibre of this man Melville that he chose to cling to the colour rather than cling to the horse. He was immediately separated from the horse and was left, as Higginson described, being washed downstream at a tremendous pace, careening off rocks and boulders, but all the time keeping the Queen's colour aloft above his head. As he was being washed past the coffin-shaped rock, he saw Higginson, and he shouted desperately at him, "For God's sake, man, grab the pole here!" And Higginson leant out and grabbed the pole. But the force with which Melville was being washed past the rock was such that it pulled Higginson off the rock, and both men were left in the lee of that rock, in the eddy of quiet water created by the rock breaking the current of the river, scrambling up against the smooth surface of the rock with the Queen's colour. Now the Zulus see this happening, and they start to man the tree line opposite the rock on the Zulu bank, and they started to pelt these men with assegais, and they fired at them with their Enfield Schneiders and their Tower muskets. And that is the sight that Coghill sees. That is the sight that prompted him to do what he then did. Greater love hath no man. He galloped his horse upstream along the Natal bank to compensate for the current, turned the animal, plunged it back into the main stream. He was going to the rescue of his friend with the colour, bad knee and all. Higginson says that the Zulus saw Coghill coming, and immediately they directed their fire at him, and almost the first shot hit Coghill's horse smack between the eyes and killed it. So much for the Zulus being poor marksmen. This of course pitched Coghill out of the saddle into the main stream, where he had the choice of either swimming back to the Natal bank or swimming on. And being the sort of person that he was, he swam on, and in due course reached the rock, and there were now 3 men cowering in the lee of that rock under a veritable hail of assegais and lead coming from the Zulu bank. Higginson tells us that the 3 of them decided that to stay there would be stupid and suicidal, so they decided to swim for it with the Queen's colour. They kicked themselves into the stream, which picked them up and tossed them over all the immense rocks and boulders in the rapid below the pool, and in the midst of this they lost their grip on the Queen's colour 1st Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, to which all regimental honour was attached, and it whirled away downstream, and it was lost, and with that regimental honour was lost. Melville and Coghill and Walter Higginson fetched up on the Natal bank of the Buffalo River. Melville was exhausted to the point of being immobile, and Coghill couldn't walk because of his bad knee. So Higginson climbed out of the gorge, onto the heights above, and searched for horses, of which apparently there were a number that had lost their riders in crossing the river, and to his credit he caught 3 horses. He was riding one, and wrestling with the impossible difficulties of trying to lead the other 2 down this precipitous terrain, when he looked down a little valley, and he saw a sight that he was never to forget. The sight was of Melville. In the interim he had recovered, and he had picked Coghill up and carried him on his back right out of the gorge. And when they came into view, Higginson could see that Melville was utterly exhausted, and he shouted down at him, "Come on, Melville, come on!" And they shouted back that they were done, and that they could go no further, and Melville and Coghill flopped down against a large rock. This large rock partially hid them from Higginson's view. Higginson says that they thought that there were no Zulus after them, the inference being that they would simply have to make the last little way up to where the horses were. But it was not to be. Suddenly, there were Zulus all over the place. There were shrieks of "Usutu!" and "Ngadla!" and it was all over. Melville and Coghill were obviously dead, and Higginson turned his horses and made his weary way back to help Makar, where he put in his report. The question obviously now arises: who killed Melville and Coghill? The Zulus are not a nation of swimmers, and in its flooded state, the buffalo at Fugitive Drift was, for the Zulus, in my opinion, absolutely unfordable. History, however, records that some Zulus must have crossed the buffalo. We know that a large number of Zulus did cross the buffalo when they went on to attack the mission station at Rorke's Drift, and some of them, we are told, must have cut back and killed these 2 officers. Our Zulu people here have a very different and very plausible explanation concerning this event. They say that on that Wednesday afternoon, sitting up on the ledge above the crossing, watching this Wednesday afternoon entertainment going on in the river below, was the local chieftain, Sotondo Zangumalo, and his retainers. They were basking in what they considered was their neutral position, but living as they did in the British colony of Natal, they should have by right shown their loyalty to the Crown, but there was probably little doubt as to where Sotondoza's real loyalty lay. Sotondoza was then recognized by the Indunas of Zipe Pukamapita of the Indluyengwe regiment, who were sitting on the knoll opposite Fugitive Drift, and they shouted across at him, "Hey, Wena Sotondoza, we see you, we recognize you, and if you and your men don't catch up with these lame ducks at the back and ngumula them, You can rest assured that we will find a place to cross the river, and we will send some of the impi back, and we will ngumula you. And under these circumstances of intimidation, which are nothing new in this country, we believe that Melville and Coghill lost their lives. It doesn't really matter. The facts of the matter were that Melville and Coghill were dead. The Queen's colour was lost. The Battle of Isandlwana was lost. And Lord Chelmsford returned and spent that terrible night sleeping amongst the dead and disembowelled remains of his former command. Chelmsford was deeply troubled by the sight of the Oscarberg mountain off to the west being silhouetted by the fire from the burning buildings of the mission station at Rorke's Drift. Chelmsford decided to leave Isandlwana before dawn and to march to the relief of Rorke's Drift, and was, as it happened, greatly relieved to find that Rorke's Drift had in fact been held. It was the only pleasant surprise that Chelmsford got in the entire campaign. Chelmsford then had the rather unenviable task of having to ride immediately to Pietermaritzburg, so that he and his fellow architect of this war, Sir Bartle Frere, could draft a suitable telegraph to send to Sir Michael Hicks Beach in London, to inform Hicks Beach that this most powerful force had been thoroughly trounced by this bunch of savages armed with sticks. So off he goes, and he leaves in command at Rorke's Drift Colonel Richard Thomas Glynn, the man who was in fact the column commander of the whole central column, and officer commanding both battalions of the 24th Regiment of Foot. Glynn was a real character, a delightful, diminutive little man. He was 5'2" in height. He was a man easily moved to emotion and dearly loved by all his men. He had a strange personal contact with the Queen's colour that had been lost, in that as a younger officer, in 1865, he had been the first man to receive these colours on parade from Lady Woodhouse, the Curragh in Ireland. He was greatly stricken, as one can imagine, with the loss of his entire 1st Battalion, a number of officers and men of the 2nd Battalion, and with the loss of the colours. Chelmsford left him in command at Rorke's Drift with the brief that he was to see to the efficient fortification of the new fort at Rorke's Drift, and he was to collate and collect as much information as possible with respect to what had happened at Isandlwana and why. Glynn was going through all the survivors' accounts when he came upon the report of one Walter Higginson, the man who'd been attached to that coffin-shaped rock and the man who'd watched the demise of Lieutenants Melville and Coghill, and this report fills him with hope. Hope indeed that the colours had not fallen into the hands of the enemy, but rather had fallen foul of the forces of nature in the form of that flooded river, and the possibility therefore existed, however remote, that this colour may in fact be found. So a patrol was sent out, 13 days after the battle, on the 4th of February 1879, to the place which was by then known as the Fugitive Drift. Commanding the patrol was Major Wilson Black, famous in history for the way in which he used to swear at his men in Gaelic, and accompanying this patrol, as fate would have it, was none other than our friend Charlie Harford, our beloved beetle collector. Harford kept a journal, and what a wonderful account he gives us in this journal of what happened that day. He explains how the patrol descended down the well-worn path. They came around a large rock, and Harford describes the positions of the bodies of Melville and Coghill. The men duffed their helmets and caps and looked at the bodies of these brave men. They wondered at how Melville had carried Coghill over the precipitous terrain. Coghill's knee was still bound up. The bodies had been speared, but they had not been disembowelled, which is significant and I think in support of the Sotondo's story. They found Melville's watch in the pocket of his breeches. It had stopped at 10 minutes past 2, which may be telling us what time these men crossed the river. They buried the bodies under simple cairns of stones, Padre George Smith of Rorke's Drift fame reading the service. It must have been a most moving event. The next day the patrol returned. They came to the ledge of rock that overlooks the crossing. They looked down at the river. The river had receded off its flood levels and had left exposed a huge delta of dry boulders, which was now covered with every imaginable species of debris. There were dead horses and dead men, and saddles and bridles and helmets in heaps all over the rocks below. Major Black went off to the right about 300 yards and built a substantial sangar of rocks, a breastwork which was to house a covering party. The sangar stands to this very day. 3 officers were then detailed to descend the gorge to the river bed to search it in the hope of finding the lost colour, and as fate would have it, who should be selected for this auspicious task? None other than the beetle collector himself. Harford tells us that after a tremendous climb down, the three officers reached the head of the delta of rocks. Wainwright was told to stick to the water's edge as he moved downstream, and Harbour was told to stay on the Natal bank. The beetle collector was told to move through the middle of the delta, and it was thus unlikely that anything would escape detection. Harford says that they'd gone a few paces when he stumbled upon the colour case. He picked it up and shouted at the others. They bounded across and all had a look at it. Harford then put it on a large conspicuous boulder, and the men continued to search through all the heaps of stinking debris. But they found nothing. Harford then turned and looked at where Harbour was across the backwater of the river. He saw something sticking out of the water, and he yelled across at Harbour, "I say, old chap, do you see that straight bit of stick sticking up in the water opposite to you? It looks to me uncommonly like a colour pole." Harbour waded into the deep water and tugged at the stick, and the stick came free. And there is just too much in the story. That mountain, which looks so like the Sphinx on the cap badge. The eclipse of the sun as young husband dies high up on the mountain. Those patches of grassland on the Pete hill which turned into marshes at the wrong moment. Here the forces of this flooded river had left the Queen's colour upright, but upside down, with its crown locked into the rocks. It was too heavy for Harbour to lift, and he dragged it behind him to the edge of the pool. Harford was there to meet him. His was the honour. As he drew the colour pole out of the water, the silk embroidery dropped off the fabric from the long immersion in the water, but the banner of Her Majesty Queen Victoria unfurled. It was intact. The men cheered and squealed with triumph, and Major Black and the rest of them skidded down the cliff face as fast as their imperial backsides would allow. And they got onto that spit of boulders, and they held the colour aloft, and they shouted 3 times 3 for Her Majesty the Queen, and for ourselves, Harford tells us, and Major Black congratulated us and thanked us and shook us well by the hand. The men clambered up the steep slope onto the ledge at the lip of the gorge. They were moved and delighted to find that a guard of honour had been drawn up by Charles Raw, the same Raw that had found the Zulu MP prior to Isandlwana. Arms were presented, and the Queen's colour was placed onto the stirrup of Major Black's horse, and this triumphant little cavalcade started to head back to Rorke's Drift. Harford lolled in the saddle of his pony as they made their way back, thinking to himself what a lovely day he'd had. He said later that he had the same warmth in his breast that he always got when he had captured a new or rare species of butterfly, or when he'd climbed up to an almost inaccessible nest and he'd brought the egg safely down. The men looked into the distance and hoped that the signaller on the top of the Oscarberg mountain at Rorke's Drift would have seen with the telescope that they had found the colour, but it was a long shot. In fact, the whole story is a long shot. Harford movingly describes how they were in for a surprise when they came over the rise at Rorke's Drift, because, as fate would have it, the signaller on the top of the Oscarberg had seen with his telescope that the men had found the colour. He'd bolted down the back of the hill, and he had gone up to that delightful, diminutive little colonel, Richard Thomas Glynn, and had said to him, "Sir, they found your colour." Glynn had thereupon lined up every single soldier at Rorke's Drift, from the cook to the colonel himself, and thousands of men lined the road into the post. It was the greatest guard of honour that this part of the world was ever to see. The men lining the road tossed their helmets into the air and cheered. Black's men were greatly moved by this, and rode through this guard of honour amidst ringing cheers. Lovely descriptions survive that tell us that when stern-faced Wilson Black reached the head of the guard of honour, there stood Colonel Richard Thomas Glynn. And this man had his chin tucked into his chest, and the tears were rolling freely down the man's face as the Queen's colour was handed over to him, and with that regimental honour was restored. Famous incident this, and we have the woodcuts done of this scene adorning the walls of our dining room. When Queen Victoria heard what had happened, she said that had Lieutenants Melville and Coghill survived, they would have been awarded the Victoria Cross. This appears in the London Gazette, dated 2nd of May, 1879. But in 1879, there was no provision for the posthumous award of the Victoria Cross, and it was only 28 years later during the reign of King Edward VII, that these awards were approved. They were the first 2 posthumous Victoria Crosses earned in history, and we are privileged to have these men buried on our property. The Queen's colour, arguably the most famous Queen's colour in the annals of British military history, was taken into the presence of the Queen after the Anglo-Zulu War. She bestowed upon it 2 great honours. Firstly, it was thereafter allowed to be carried on parade as a 3rd colour. And secondly, she commanded that a wreath of silver immortelles be made to hang around the crown of that colour to remind everyone of what happened in this river on this day. That colour was eventually retired in 1933, having served the 24th Regiment of Foot, South Wales Borderers, for a total of 67 years, and thereupon it was hung in the side chapel of the cathedral in Brecon in Wales. This was utterly appropriate, because under those heaps of white stones that punctuate the field of Isandlwana are the bones of many Welshmen who had their homes and their families in that southern part of Wales. The inscription on the cross above Melville and Coghill's grave pertains to all of these men too. For Queen and country, Jesu mercy.